Marina Petrova is a typical housewife, like many women her age in a small provincial town. She is 42 years old, married to Alexander, a successful businessman who has long provided them with a stable and seemingly prosperous life. They have two children who have already grown up and left to study in another city. This house, in which they once all lived as one family, now seems empty, gloomy, and cold to Marina. The walls, once filled with the laughter of children and household chores, now envelop her in silence. Every day for Marina seems to follow a pattern. The morning begins with cooking breakfast for her husband, who leaves for work, then cleaning the house, going to the store and cooking lunch. When the children lived with them, all this made sense. She felt needed, in demand, surrounded by energy and care for the family. But now, Marina no longer feels that same warmth. Her husband, Alexander, spends most of his time in his office or at meetings. Their conversations have been reduced to formal remarks. How are things at work? Everything is fine. In the evenings, he comes home tired, sits down at his computer or watches TV, sometimes falling asleep right on the couch. Marina began to feel isolated, as if forgotten in her own home. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to being a wife and mother, but now that the children were gone, her life seemed meaningless. Alexander cared only about his business projects, and his home had become a hotel for him. He was a good man, but in recent years the couple had become so distant from each other that Marina sometimes felt like a stranger in her own marriage. She tried to find things to do that would fill the void in her life. She took cooking classes, joined a fitness club, even tried to meet up with friends from her past, but none of it brought her true satisfaction. Time dragged on slowly, and each day seemed exactly the same as the previous one. Marina often thought about how her life would have turned out if she had ever chosen a different path. Her youth was spent making sacrifices for the sake of her family. While still at university, she met Alexander, fell in love with his ambition and determination. At that moment, he was ready to conquer the world, and Marina believed in him, supported him. They got married right after graduation, and she gave up her career in law for the sake of children and family life. Now, 20 years later, she thought about what she had lost. It seemed that life had passed her by while she was busy with the house and children. Alexander had managed to realize his dreams. He had a successful business, cars, a house, and Marina had remained on the sidelines of his success, having turned into a woman who no longer knew what she wanted. Realizing her dissatisfaction, she began to notice that she was drawn to things that had previously seemed foreign to her. She spent more time on social media, browsing the pages of people who were living vibrant, fulfilling lives. Some of them were traveling the world, others were developing their own businesses, and still others were enjoying meeting new people. She was fascinated and terrified at the same time. Deep down, she knew that she would never have made such a drastic change on her own. She had lived in Alexander's shadow for too long that she had lost her identity. But all these thoughts remained inside until one day she met Sergei. This meeting was accidental, but it completely changed her life. At that moment, Marina didn't yet know that a whole new world would open up before her, full of dangerous passions and deceptive illusions, which would lead her to tragedy. But at that moment, it seemed to her that fate was finally giving her a chance to escape from the gray, everyday life. It was an ordinary day that started like all the others, with an early rise, breakfast for her husband, and a little house cleaning. After all the morning routine, Marina decided to go to a local cafe to drink coffee and read a magazine. She felt that she needed a change of scenery to get out of the house, to somehow diversify her boring life. A small cafe in the city center was her salvation. It was always cozy and quiet there. Usually she took a book or a magazine with her to distract herself from thoughts about everyday affairs. But on this day, everything was different. Sitting at a table by the window and ordering coffee, Marina thought about how much her inner state had changed in recent months. She looked at the passers-by who were hurrying about their business and suddenly felt a strange loneliness. When did my life become so empty? She thought. Fragments of memories of past years when everything seemed so simple and clear kept playing over and over in her head. And then she noticed him. Sergei walked into the cafe with an ease and confidence that immediately caught her eye. He was a young man, about 15 years younger than her, perhaps a little over 30, tall, with dark hair and an athletic build. He was dressed in fashionable but not flashy clothes, jeans and a light leather jacket. His confidence and carefree gait immediately attracted the attention of not only Marina, but also several other visitors to the cafe. He ordered a coffee to go, but for some reason he lingered at the cash register, casting a few quick glances in Marina's direction. Their eyes met for a moment, and Marina felt a strange thrill. She looked away, slightly embarrassed, not used to such attention. Sergei, noticing her reaction, went to the counter where the magazines were and picked one up, not taking his eyes off Marina. The gesture seemed so natural, as if he was simply looking for an excuse to linger in the cafe. "Is the coffee good here?" he asked unexpectedly, turning to her. Marina was a little confused, not expecting the young man to talk to her. She looked at him, trying to understand whether he was joking or not, but there was a slight smile on his face without a trace of mockery. "Yes, quite good," she answered, trying not to show how surprised she was by this attention. Sergei sat down on the chair opposite without waiting for an invitation and began to talk casually. "I'm new here, looking for a nice place to hang out," he said, nodding toward his coffee cup. "This cafe was recommended." Marina nodded back, trying to act calm, but inside she was seething. It had been a long time since she had been so interested in someone. A young and attractive guy, talking to her so easily and casually, made her feel noticeable, important, even attractive. She felt that he was probably just being polite, but she still couldn't help but enjoy his attention. "I'm Marina," she introduced herself, deciding it would be stupid to stay away. He extended his hand and replied with a slight grin. "Sergei." His handshake was firm, his gaze piercing. Marina couldn't help but notice how carefully he was examining her. What does he see, she thought? An ordinary, middle-aged woman? She tried not to think about it, but her heart was beating faster than usual. The conversation started easily. Sergei told her that he had recently arrived in their city, worked remotely, and was involved in some unclear investment-related matters. He was mysterious, but not so much that he seemed suspicious. Marina felt his energy captivating her. She had not communicated with such a young, self-confident man for a long time. He did not look at her as an aging housewife as she sometimes imagined herself. Sergei looked at her with interest, as a woman, and this was a new and pleasant feeling. The minutes flew by. The coffee grew cold, but their conversation continued. Sergei was witty, easily switching from topic to topic, and Marina, despite her inner restraint, enjoyed every moment. She even became a little anxious that she had allowed herself to relax so much in his presence. She felt that this young man could become something more than just a casual acquaintance. When it was time to say goodbye, Sergei did not miss the opportunity to ask her to meet again. He took her phone number with the same ease with which he had spoken to her for the first time. Marina, somewhat embarrassed but flattered, agreed. They exchanged short goodbyes, and Sergei left, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She watched him go, feeling strangely excited and afraid at the same time. Something about him made her wary, but she couldn't figure out what it was. His confidence, his youth, or the fact that there was something about him that drew her like a magnet. Marina didn't know where this meeting would lead, but deep down she felt that her life was beginning to change. The first weeks of their relationship were, as it seemed to Marina, filled with happiness and new emotions. Sergei was becoming an integral part of her life. He knew how to support her, give compliments that she had long since stopped believing, and filled every day with a veil of mystery and passion. However, over time, the situation began to change. Sergei, who had previously been just an attractive young man interested in her as a woman, began to openly use his influence. Every day, Sergei spoke more and more often about his plans for the future. He created images of an ideal world in which the two of them would live freely, without any obligations. Sergei told Marina how she deserved more, how her current life was just an illusion imposed by society, and that she should think about herself, about her happiness. These conversations penetrated her soul. She herself thought about how she had lived someone else's life for many years, sacrificing her desires for the sake of her family. Sergei said exactly what she wanted to hear, and he did it so sincerely that Marina could not help but believe him. However, with these conversations, the first signs of manipulation began to come. Sergei hinted more and more at his difficulties. At first, these were light complaints. "You know, I would like to buy a car, but money is tight at the moment," or "My business project is almost ready, but I don't have enough capital." He said this so casually, as if in passing, as if he did not expect help. But Marina, feeling guilty for her pleasure and trying to help her loved one, began to offer him support. At first, these were small amounts that she took from the general budget, confident that her husband would not notice. She bought him gifts, new clothes, an expensive watch, even a phone that he accidentally lost. Sergei accepted all this with gratitude, but his appetites gradually grew. He began to talk more and more about his business plans, which required significant investment. His charm and self-confidence made Marina feel that she was obliged to help him. She was sure that this was temporary, that Sergei simply needed support to rise to a new level, and soon their relationship would become even stronger. In reality, however, Sergei increasingly showed himself to be a skilled manipulator. He knew exactly what words to use to make Marina act in his interests. When she hesitated or began to doubt, he knew how to press on her weak points. He told her that she was the only person he could count on, that only she truly understood him. These words made Marina feel important, and she sank deeper into this relationship, despite her growing sense of anxiety. One day, Sergei asked her for a big favor, to lend him a significant amount for a new project. He talked about how this project would change their lives, how they would be able to become independent and live for their own pleasure, travel, and enjoy life. Marina, under his influence, agreed without hesitation. She took the money out of the family savings without telling Alexander. Her husband, busy with his own affairs, did not immediately notice the loss, and this gave Marina a false sense of security. Over time, Sergei became increasingly impatient. He became less attentive. Their meetings became shorter. Now he talked more about money, about how badly his affairs were going, and how much he was doing for their future together. Sergei skillfully instilled in Marina a sense of guilt for not doing more for him. He used her fear of loss, forcing her to think that without her support, their relationship would simply fall apart. Marina, immersed in her feelings, could not see the truth. Sergei was with her not because of love, but for profit. One evening, as they sat in the same cafe where their story began, Sergei frankly declared, "You know, Marina, I need even more money to complete the project. If we don't get it done in time, everything will go to hell." His voice was firm, without a hint of a request. It was an ultimatum. Marina felt anxiety boiling inside her. She had already given him most of the family savings, and now she didn't know where to get more money. But she couldn't refuse him. She was afraid that she would lose him, that without this money Sergei would leave, and her life would become empty and gray again. "I'll think about it," she squeezed out, trying to find a way out. But Sergei continued to press. "Think about it? We are a team, Marina. Don't you want us to succeed? Or don't you believe in our future?" He looked at her with a cold seriousness that inspired fear. At that moment, Marina realized that Sergei was using her, but admitting it to herself was too painful. She still hoped that this was a temporary difficulty, that their relationship would survive this crisis. But inside her, a feeling of hopelessness was growing. She began to understand that behind Sergei's external attractiveness and charm, there was something darker, cold calculation and a thirst for profit. Marina found herself trapped by her own feelings and fears, plunging further and further into the world of lies and manipulation that Sergei had so skillfully built around her. Several days had passed since their first meeting, but Marina could not stop thinking about Sergei. His image constantly popped into her mind, a confident gait, a penetrating gaze, and a way of speaking that made her feel important and interesting. In recent years, her husband had never looked at her with such attention. Alexander was carried away by his own affairs, and Marina had long since lost hope for any revival in their relationship. But with the appearance of Sergei, everything changed. Her heart was beating the alarm, warning that something was wrong, but her mind refused to acknowledge it. Just a pleasant acquaintance, she reassured herself, although she knew perfectly well that this was far from the case. Sergei called her a couple of days after their first meeting and invited her to dinner. Marina, after some hesitation, finally agreed, convincing herself that this was an innocent meeting and there was nothing serious about it. The meeting took place in one of the small restaurants outside the city. Sergei chose a secluded place, which immediately caused Marina a slight anxiety, but his confidence and ease of communication quickly dispelled her fears. Wine, a pleasant atmosphere, and unobtrusive conversation did their job. Marina felt relaxed and even a little free, as if she had returned many years ago to her younger years. Sergei knew how to keep up the conversation, asking questions about her life, her feelings, dreams, and desires, everything that she had not talked about even to herself for a long time. He deftly dodged conversations about himself, in every possible way avoiding details about his life. But for some reason, this did not alarm Marina. It seemed to her that she had found in him someone who was ready to listen and understand. That evening they talked for several hours, and when Marina was about to leave, Sergei suddenly took her hand, looking her straight in the eyes. It was unexpected and embarrassing, but at the same time exciting. Marina's heart sped up when, without saying a word, he leaned down and softly kissed her lips. It was a moment she could not have foreseen, but had been waiting for days deep down in her soul. His kiss was full of confidence and passion, but at the same time careful and subtle, as if Sergei knew he should not frighten her. After that evening, Marina realized that their relationship had gone beyond just acquaintance. She couldn't explain to herself how it happened, but from the moment their lips met, something changed in her life. She felt a wave of adrenaline and excitement mixed with guilt. Every time she remembered that kiss, the image of her husband appeared before her eyes. Alexander was a good man, and she couldn't imagine betraying him. But at the same time, she understood that something in their marriage had died a long time ago, that she lacked love, attention, and passion. Sergei started writing to her daily. At first, these were short but sweet messages in which he asked about her affairs and well-being. Then they became more frank. He was not shy about sharing his desires, inviting her to new meetings. Marina hesitated every time before agreeing, but something drew her to him. His youth, confidence, attention. She began to hide their correspondence from her husband, erased all the messages with his numbers, fearing that Alexander might suspect something. Their meetings became more frequent. Sergei was a master of illusions. He told her what she wanted to hear, created an illusory world around her in which it was just the two of them. Every time they met, Marina felt her heart fill with warmth and passion that she had not experienced for a long time. These moments seemed real to her, as if she were living again, and not just existing. However, behind all these emotions, she did not notice one thing. Sergei began to demand more and more from her. At first, these were trifles. He asked her to give him something insignificant, a new phone or clothes. Marina happily fulfilled his requests, feeling generous and needed. But gradually his requests became more serious. Sergei hinted that he wanted to open his own business, asked her to lend him money to make his dreams come true. Marina, in love and carried away by this new world of passion and illusions, agreed without hesitation. She began to take money from the family savings, hiding it from Alexander. Sergei skillfully played on her feelings, each time convincing her that these were temporary difficulties, that they would soon be together, and everything would be fine. But fear was already beginning to grow inside her. She felt that she was losing control of the situation, but she couldn't stop. Sergei was her salvation, her only light in this world of loneliness and gray everyday life. Marina closed her eyes to the serious problems that were starting to unfold around her, hoping that this was just a temporary infatuation that would soon end. But fate was already preparing a cruel lesson for her. Marina could no longer deny it. Her life had changed beyond recognition. The woman who had once been completely focused on family, home, and maintaining comfort was now turning into a person obsessed with something dangerous and destructive. Day after day, her thoughts were occupied with only one thing: Sergei. Each new step, each new request from him only pulled her deeper into a whirlpool of doubts and anxiety, which, as she hoped, were temporarily hidden behind the mask of passion. Previously confident and calm, Marina became restless and nervous. She began to notice that all her time and thoughts were devoted to one thing: how to please Sergei and how to find money to satisfy his endless demands. Household chores that used to please her, taking care of the house, cooking for the family, began to irritate her. Now every morning she woke up with an oppressive feeling of guilt and fear of exposure. Her phone was always at hand, and every message from Sergei made her heart skip a beat. Now, instead of a calm morning with a cup of coffee, she hastily checked the balance on her bank accounts, trying to figure out how much more she could take without arousing her husband's suspicions. Her appearance also began to change. Previously, Marina was neat and looked after herself, preferring elegance and restraint. Now, under Sergei's influence, she began to spend money on expensive things to look younger and more fashionable, as Sergei said. She began to buy luxurious clothes and cosmetics, tried to keep her figure in perfect shape, even went to beauty salons. All this looked like an attempt to match the image of the woman Sergei saw her as, but inside she felt that she was losing herself. Friends and neighbors began to notice changes in Marina. Those who were close to her saw that something was wrong. She began to avoid their meetings, became withdrawn, often refusing to go to cafes or hang out with friends. When someone tried to find out what was going on, Marina would say she was tired or had a busy life. But deep down, she knew that she did not want to discuss her problem with anyone, because that would mean admitting that she was making a mistake. Her attitude toward her husband was especially disturbing. Alexander, the man who had been her support for many years, became like a stranger to her. She avoided communicating with him as much as she could. Their conversations were limited to a simple exchange of formalities. "How are you? How was your day?" Standard questions to which neither of them had expected sincere answers for a long time. She no longer felt the same affection and love for him. Moreover, she began to get irritated with him because of his inattention. Marina found justification for her behavior in his lack of concern, convincing herself that it was his coldness that led her to this relationship with Sergei. But at some point, her inner world began to crumble. The passion and excitement she felt at the beginning of their affair were replaced by anxiety and a sense of dependence. Sergei began to disappear for days at a time without explanation. He wrote less often, and their meetings became less and less frequent. When they did see each other, Sergei always found a reason to talk about his problems and money. Their dates no longer brought the pleasure they had before. The sincere interest that had so attracted her at the beginning of their affair had disappeared from his eyes. Now Sergei looked at her as a means to achieve his goals, and not as a woman he wanted to be with. One day, sitting on the edge of her bed in her bedroom, Marina caught herself thinking that her life was increasingly resembling a nightmare from which there was no escape. She had lost touch with herself, with her past, and worst of all, with those who were dear to her. She understood that she was going down a dangerous path, but she did not know how to stop. A conflict raged in her soul. On the one hand, she wanted to return to her previous life, in which there was confidence and stability, but on the other, she was drawn to Sergei, as if he were the last chance for a new, brighter life. With each passing day, Marina sank deeper into her inner torment. She increasingly thought that her behavior was beyond the pale. Every day, she promised herself that this was her last step toward Sergei, that she would no longer give in to his requests. But every time he called or wrote, her resolve melted, as if she were completely under his control. Sergei had become her weakness, her secret, which she could not reveal to anyone. But Marina didn't know yet that soon her world would finally collapse. The clouds were gathering over her life, and a real storm was waiting for her ahead. Alexander Petrov, Marina's husband, was a man completely absorbed in his work. He often left early in the morning and returned late at night, busy with his projects and constant business meetings. He thought that in this way he provided his family with well-being, and that should be enough. However, recently he began to notice changes in his wife's behavior that did not give him peace. Marina had changed. Before, she was always there, caring for him, keeping up conversations, and their dinners together were always calm and cozy. But now, she had become cold and distant. Alexander couldn't help but notice that her thoughts were always somewhere far away. She was often absent from home, and if she was, she seemed absent-minded, hardly spoke, and avoided looking him in the eye. Her phone, which used to usually lie on the table or kitchen shelf, was now always at hand. She became nervous when they called and carefully avoided talking on the phone in his presence. At first, Alexander attributed it to a normal female mood or fatigue. He thought it was temporary and that they could return to the old days when everything was simple and clear. However, over time his suspicions began to grow stronger. Marina's appearance had also changed. Previously she always dressed practically, for convenience around the house, but lately she began to pay too much attention to her appearance. Expensive outfits, new accessories, trips to beauty salons. These changes in her appearance and behavior alarmed Alexander, and the thought began to mature in his head that this was not just a matter of boredom or a simple change of image. One evening, when they were sitting at dinner, Alexander tried to start a normal conversation. He asked her how her day had gone, but Marina answered coldly, briefly, and practically without raising her eyes from her plate. "Is something happening?" he asked quietly, looking at her carefully. "You've become different lately." Marina froze for a moment. Her hand trembled slightly, but she quickly pulled herself together and answered, "I'm fine. I'm just tired. Nothing special." She tried to answer as convincingly as possible, but her voice betrayed the tension. Alexander did not insist, but inside, his anxiety was growing. He noticed how she avoided his gaze, how quickly she finished dinner and immediately went to the bedroom, leaving him alone at the table. That night, Alexander could not sleep for a long time. He lay in bed next to his wife, who was pretending to be asleep, and tried to understand what was happening. His heart was beating heavily from anxious thoughts. He felt that an insurmountable wall had formed between them which he could not destroy, and this filled him with fear. The next day, Alexander decided to take action. He understood that something was being hidden from him, and it could not be ignored. He began to check their family accounts and was surprised to discover that significant amounts had disappeared from the common budget in recent months. These expenses were unusual, for things they did not usually buy, and the amounts were much larger than usual. Alexander could not believe his eyes. He always trusted Marina and did not control her spending, believing that they were on the same page and always acted together. However, now he saw that something was clearly wrong. The money was disappearing, but he didn't know where. Alexander decided to talk to her about it, but internally, he was preparing for the worst. Suspicions of betrayal began to creep into his head. The thought that Marina could meet someone, communicate with someone, oppressed him. But he still hoped that this was just a misunderstanding, that the reason could be something else. When Marina returned home in the evening, Alexander decided not to postpone the conversation. He sat down with her at the table and asked directly, "I noticed that large sums of money have disappeared from our accounts. Can you explain what the money was spent on?" Marina flinched as if she had been caught red-handed. She was not prepared for such a direct question. Her face instantly turned pale. Her hands began to shake. She tried to find the strength to say something, but her voice betrayed her. Her head was filled with thoughts about Sergei and how to explain the disappearance of the money, but nothing plausible came to mind. I bought some things for the house," she answered uncertainly, but her voice sounded so weak that Alexander immediately realized that she was lying. His eyes narrowed. It was the moment of truth when he realized that Marina was hiding something important. "Household items?" he repeated, looking at her intently. "Do you really want me to believe that? Marina, I'm not a stupid person. What's going on?" Marina could no longer bear the tension. Her heart was beating as if it was about to jump out of her chest. She understood that she was on the edge, that it was no longer possible to hide the truth. But admitting to Alexander that she had betrayed him for another man was too painful. She lowered her head, unable to look him in the eye, and muttered, I don't know. It's all too complicated. I need time." Alexander knew he couldn't trust his wife anymore. His suspicions had grown, and now he had no doubt that Marina was hiding something. That night, he didn't insist on continuing the conversation, but he decided to act differently. He wasn't going to leave this matter to chance. Alexander decided to find out the whole truth, no matter what it cost him. After that conversation with her husband, Marina was beside herself. Alexander clearly did not believe her excuses, and every look he gave her now seemed suspicious. She felt like she was on the edge of an abyss. The fear of being exposed was literally eating her up from the inside. Every step was dictated by panic. Every look from her husband was a hidden threat. But the most terrible thing was that she understood that she no longer had the money to satisfy Sergei's demands. Sergei, in turn, became increasingly demanding and even aggressive in his requests. Now he spoke openly about his problems with money. Marina increasingly heard reproaches and discontent in his messages and calls. "You promised to help me," he said in an irritated voice during yet another phone conversation. "You know I was counting on you. I put so much effort into this project, and now you just abandon me when I need support?" Marina felt like she was backed into a wall. She couldn't refuse him, but she couldn't help him anymore. All the savings she could take from the family budget were spent, and Alexander had already started asking questions. But Sergei wasn't going to stop. His voice was getting harsher, and the true essence of a man who was ready to do anything for his own benefit began to emerge. "If you can't give me money," Sergei continued, "I'll find someone who can. But then don't expect me to be with you any longer. You don't want that, do you?" These words pierced Marina like a knife. The fear of losing Sergei, his attention, his love, was stronger than reason. She felt trapped. On one side, her husband, who was beginning to suspect something, and on the other, Sergei, who was putting more and more pressure on her every day. Her world was collapsing, and she didn't know how to stop this process. In desperation, Marina began to think about extreme measures. She wondered how else she could get money without attracting her husband's attention. The situation was getting worse day by day. Her hands were shaking as she reviewed the bills. There was no stash left, and Sergey was not going to wait. He called her more and more often with requests for meetings, and each meeting ended with him demanding more money. One evening, when Alexander was at work and the children were away, Marina found herself in the complete darkness of her bedroom, staring at her phone. She knew that the only way to get money was to take out a loan. The idea was crazy, but Sergey left her no choice. He convinced her that without this money, their future together was impossible. The next day, Marina went to the bank. The very thought that she was going to take out a loan without her husband's knowledge made her heart beat at an incredible speed. But the feeling of fear of Sergey and his reaction was stronger. She filled out all the necessary documents, explaining to herself that this was a temporary measure, and when Sergey's project was successful, they would return everything. The bank approved the loan, and soon a large sum was deposited into her account. She transferred the money to Sergey, expecting that after that he would become more gentle and attentive. However, as soon as he received the transfer, Sergey became even colder and more distant. He responded to her calls and messages less and less. Marina was left alone more and more often, wondering what she had done wrong. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to follow Marina. Her behavior did not improve, and his suspicions grew stronger. He could not understand where the money was going and what was happening to his wife. One day, he decided to check their bank accounts and discovered a new loan. This was the last straw for him. He realized that the matter was much more serious than he had assumed. Alexander didn't know all the details, but he now had good reason to believe that Marina was leading a double life. The money was disappearing at an alarming rate, and he couldn't turn a blind eye to it any longer. Deciding that he would no longer remain silent, Alexander began to search for information about what was really going on. He needed to uncover the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. Marina, finding herself in the midst of her own lies and financial problems, did not know what awaited her. She did not yet understand that this whole situation was heading towards a catastrophic end. After Marina transferred a large sum of money to Sergey's account, she hoped for changes in their relationship. She thought that now everything would get better. Sergey would gain financial stability and start paying more attention to her, as he did at the beginning of their affair. But reality turned out to be much more cruel and ruthless than her illusions. Sergey began to behave more and more coldly and distantly. He no longer responded to her messages as quickly as before. Their meetings became less frequent and their conversations became shorter. Marina felt that she was losing control of the situation, and this filled her soul with panic. Each of his silences for several days caused her the strongest anxiety. She could not understand what was happening and why, after she had done everything possible for him, Sergey was starting to distance himself. One day, Marina decided to take a risk and came to the same restaurant where they often met, without warning. She hoped to see him there, and they could spend time together, talk like before. However, when she entered the hall, her heart sank. Sergey was sitting at one of the distant tables, but he was not alone. Next to him was a young woman who looked about 20 years younger than Marina. She was beautiful and well-groomed. Her laughter filled the hall with light carelessness. Sergey leaned towards her and whispered something in her ear, causing her to laugh. Marina was dumbfounded. She couldn't believe her eyes. Sergey seemed completely indifferent to the fact that a few weeks ago he and Marina had talked about the future, made plans together. Now he was completely absorbed by this new woman. At that moment, Marina felt her inner world finally crumbling. All her sacrifices, money, time that she had spent on Sergey, all of it had been in vain. He had found a new victim, young and attractive, just like she once was. Sergey didn't notice her presence, or perhaps he simply ignored her. Marina stood aside, not daring to approach. She saw how this girl gently touched Sergey's hand, and how he looked at her with that same gleam in his eyes that was once reserved only for Marina. One thought rang in her head. He used me. It was all a lie. When Marina returned home, she was beside herself. Memories of that scene in the restaurant haunted her. She realized that Sergei was a hunter who used her only for money, and now he had found a new prey. He skillfully manipulated her while she had money, but as soon as she found herself in a difficult situation, he immediately switched to another woman. Marina tried to call Sergei, sent him messages, but he did not answer. Despair and hopelessness began to form in her head. She still could not come to terms with the fact that she had lost him. This feeling of dependence that Sergei had so skillfully cultivated in her did not give her peace. She felt betrayed, but even worse, she felt used. Meanwhile, Sergei continued to develop a relationship with the new woman, as he once did with Marina. He knew that Marina could no longer give him what he needed, which meant that her time was up. The new victim was younger, more naive, and, most importantly, had access to money. Sergei acted according to a well-established scheme. He showered her with compliments, promised a future together, talked about his business plans and need for help. He did all this with ease, knowing exactly how to press the right strings. Marina, meanwhile, was sinking into a deep depression. Her finances were at zero, and she had to pay off the loan she had taken. She understood that if Alexander found out about her debts and her relationship with Sergei, their marriage would be destroyed. She had already lost herself and trust in people. Her heart was torn between guilt before her husband and hatred for herself for her weakness. Every day, looking at her phone, Marina hoped that Sergei would write at least one message, but she knew that this would not happen. She was just a temporary means to achieve his goals, as was now this new woman. Sergei had always been a gold-digger, a skilled manipulator who knew how to use people for his own interests. As Marina sank deeper into despair and hopelessness, her life began to fall apart. She could only watch as her mistakes and weaknesses destroyed everything she once valued. But an even crueler blow of fate awaited her, one that would prove fatal. After Marina saw Sergei with another woman, her world finally collapsed. The few grains of hope that still remained in her heart were trampled. She could no longer deceive herself and believe that her relationship with Sergei had any future. She realized that everything that had happened between them was a lie, built on her own illusions and a desperate need to feel wanted and needed. Sergei used her, pumped out money, manipulated her feelings, and now he simply moved on to another woman, leaving Marina with nothing. Despair enveloped her like a thick cloud, making it hard to breathe. She spent days and nights wondering how things could have gotten this bad. Memories of the happy years with Alexander, of the children, of the quiet life she had destroyed, haunted her. Every time Marina saw her husband or heard his voice, she was overcome by a wave of shame and guilt. She realized that she could no longer look him in the eye, could not speak to him normally. Her secret poisoned everything around her. The husband, despite his suspicions, continued to monitor her behavior. Alexander saw that Marina had changed even more. Her behavior became strange. She locked herself in the bedroom, spent a lot of time alone, rarely went outside, and almost did not communicate with him. Her appearance changed. Marina looked tired, exhausted, with bags under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Her beauty, which Sergei had once used as a tool for manipulation, was fading before his eyes. One morning, waking up earlier than usual, Marina realized that she couldn't go on like this. She couldn't stand the pressure of guilt and fear any longer. She had lost not only her husband's money and trust, but also herself. Sergei had destroyed her, taken everything she had, and now that he didn't need her, he had simply disappeared. She no longer felt like a human being. Every step she took was painful. Every thought was destructive. In desperation, Marina decided to take the last step, to meet with Sergei and demand an explanation. Her mind insisted that it was useless, but her heart, still dependent on this man, hoped for answers. She needed to know why he did this to her, why he abandoned her at the most difficult moment when she was ready to give him everything. Marina, gathering her last strength, called Sergei. He did not answer right away, and when he finally picked up, his voice was cold and indifferent. He did not offer to meet, but Marina insisted, and after a few minutes he reluctantly agreed to meet. They met in the same restaurant where it all began, but now everything was different. Sergei was no longer the charming, attentive man she had thought he was before. He came with a cold, empty look and did not even bother to show her the slightest joy at the meeting. This was the moment when Marina realized this was not the man she had fallen in love with. This was a manipulator, heartless and calculating, a man who used her only for his own purposes. "Why did you do this to me?" Her voice was quiet but full of pain. "I did everything for you, gave you everything I had. You promised that we would be together. You said that you loved me." Sergei looked at her calmly, as if none of this concerned him. His answer was as cold as ice. "I never promised you anything serious, Marina. You came up with it yourself. Yes, you helped me, but I didn't force you to do it. You made a choice. You knew what you were getting into." The words hit her in the chest. Marina felt her breathing become heavy and her hands began to shake. How could she have been so blind? How could she have believed that this man really cared about her? "You used me," she whispered, looking into his eyes, hoping to see at least a shadow of remorse. "That's the way the world is," Sergei replied, shrugging his shoulders indifferently. "People use each other. You just couldn't understand it in time." Marina couldn't believe that the man she shared her soul with was so cold-blooded. She realized that for him she was just a step towards achieving his goals. It was like a slap in the face, but this time not a physical one, but an emotional one, stronger and more painful. When Sergei stood up to leave, Marina realized that this was the end. There were no more illusions in her life. Everything she had built up over the past months was a lie. He had disappeared, leaving her alone in the restaurant in complete despair. All her efforts, all the money she had invested in this relationship were in vain. She was left with nothing. Marina returned home feeling completely empty. She had no more energy or hope. Her life was in tatters and she didn't know how to move forward. She had lost not only her money and her relationship with Sergei, but also her marriage, which was now on the verge of collapse. Alexander was getting closer and closer to discovering her secret, and her strength was waning with each passing day. But even more difficult trials awaited her ahead, which would lead to a tragic ending that she could not have foreseen. That night, Marina couldn't sleep again. After meeting Sergei, she felt completely empty. There was no plan in her head, no ideas on how to fix the situation. Everything seemed to be destroyed to the ground, and her life was slowly but inexorably rolling into the abyss. She realized that she could no longer run away from the consequences of her actions. Alexander, as always, was already at work when she woke up. Marina knew that he had begun to suspect her of lying, and now she lived in constant fear. Every time she heard his voice, her heart sank with pain and shame. She couldn't stand his looks, couldn't meet him in the room and pretend that everything was normal. But the truth was still with her, and she hoped that she could somehow save her last vestiges of dignity. However, Alexander was not going to wait any longer. He had long felt that something was wrong, and his suspicions were growing stronger. All the pieces of this dark puzzle began to fit together in his head. One morning, when Marina was away on business, Alexander decided to act decisively. He started with his wife's phone. It had never occurred to him to check her phone before. In 20 years of marriage, he had never doubted her honesty. But everything had changed. When he took her phone and began searching for traces of correspondence, he noticed deleted messages, but one remained. A short phrase from Sergei. "When will we see each other?" That was the key to the mystery. His heart started beating faster when he read the message. He immediately felt a wave of anger and resentment. Many questions started spinning in his head. Who is Sergei? What does he mean to Marina? Why did she hide this from him? Alexander was depressed and could not believe that everything he and Marina had built for so many years could be destroyed because of some stranger. But the worst was yet to come. Alexander decided to go further and check the bank statements. He knew that the financial documents had to be true. Once at the computer, he went into the bank's personal account and began to look through the transactions on the accounts. As soon as he saw the huge sums that Marina had transferred to unknown accounts, his suspicions were confirmed. The money they had saved for years had disappeared. These were the same amounts that Marina had quietly withdrawn from their shared budget, passing it off as household expenses or small expenses. His eyes widened in shock as he realized the scale of the betrayal. This wasn't just an affair. This was a betrayal of their future together. He realized that all the money had gone to Sergei, who was obviously using Marina for his own purposes. Alexander felt his heart squeeze with pain and anger. He sat in his chair, clenching his fists, not knowing how to react to all this. When Marina returned home, the atmosphere in the house was tense. She immediately felt that something was wrong. Alexander was cold and silent. There was no longer any doubt or expectation in his gaze. It was the gaze of a man who knew the truth. He was sitting at the table, holding documents in his hands that were proof of her betrayal. "We need to talk," he said quietly but firmly when Marina entered the room. Her heart sank. She knew this moment would come, but she still wasn't ready. Marina sat down across from him, feeling her body fill with fear. Alexander, without saying a word, placed the bank transaction printouts in front of her. "What is this?" he asked, looking her straight in the eyes. Marina looked away. Her hands began to shake. She couldn't think of any explanation that could save her at this moment. She knew that the truth was out, and now she would have to face the consequences. "It's money. She started to speak, but her voice betrayed her. The words caught in her throat and she couldn't finish the sentence. "This isn't money for the family," Alexander continued. "This is money you transferred to this Sergei. Who is he? What's going on? Do you think I haven't noticed all this time?" His voice was full of anger, but there was also pain in it. The pain of a man who had been faithful and devoted to his wife all his life, and now felt betrayed and deceived. Marina could not lie any longer. She knew that it was all over and that now she would have to tell the whole truth. I was stupid," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "I met him a few months ago. I thought he cared about me, that I meant something to him. I don't know how it happened. I lost my head. I gave him the money thinking he would help us, but he used me. I know it was a mistake, but—" Alexander was silent, listening to her confessions. His face was stony, but inside he was seething. He tried to understand how Marina could have done this. Thoughts were spinning in his head about how everything could have been different if he had paid attention to their relationship earlier. He knew their marriage was not ideal, but he did not expect it to go this far. When Marina finished speaking, there was silence. This silence was unbearable. There was tension in the air, and Marina felt that she could not bear it any longer. She waited for Alexander to take his anger out on her, to shout or at least say something harsh. But he remained silent. "Do you know what this means?" Alexander finally said quietly. "You destroyed everything we had. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. Now nothing can be returned." Marina covered her face with her hands, feeling tears rolling down her cheeks. She realized that she had lost everything. After the truth about her betrayal was revealed, Marina found herself on the verge of despair. Her life was falling apart before her eyes. Her marriage to Alexander was practically destroyed. Her trust was completely lost. She no longer knew how to continue living in a house where she was no longer considered part of the family. But even in this state, Marina could not let go of thoughts about Sergei. Her pain and humiliation seemed unbearable to her, and despite everything that had happened, she wanted answers. The next day, gathering her last bit of strength and determination, Marina decided to meet Sergei again. She knew that this would be her last attempt. Her mental state was on edge, and she knew that if she didn't meet him now, she would never get a chance to say everything that had accumulated over this time. Marina called Sergei and asked for a meeting, to which he reluctantly agreed. His tone was cold, and this only increased her internal tension. They agreed to meet in the same cafe where their relationship had once begun. When Marina entered the cafe, Sergei was already sitting at a table, as always, with an expression of indifference on his face. He didn't even bother to stand up to greet her, which hurt her even more. This was the same man she had once considered her salvation, and now he looked like a stranger to her, ready to get rid of her like an unnecessary thing. Marina sat down opposite him, feeling her hands tremble with tension. She looked at him, trying to catch at least some emotion on his face, but saw only coldness and indifference. "Why did you do this to me?" she began, her voice quiet but firm. "Why did you use me? I gave you everything, I ruined my life for you, and you just walked away like I was nothing." Sergei looked at her as if he was bored and shrugged. "You knew what you were getting into," he said indifferently. "I didn't promise you anything. You made your own choice." These words pierced Marina like a knife. Her face turned pale, and she felt her whole body seized with fear and pain. She knew he was right about one thing. She had made a choice, but she never expected that her love and trust would be completely betrayed. Marina felt anger boiling inside her. "You made me believe that we would be together." Her voice grew louder, she was barely holding back tears. "You said that you loved me, you manipulated me, and now you just throw me away like trash?" Sergei just grinned, his smile cold and emotionless. "Marina, you're taking this too seriously. It was just a romance. You gave me what I wanted, and that's it. It was fun, but now it's over. It's time to move on." These words finally broke Marina. She could no longer contain her emotions. Anger and despair took over. She leaned towards him, clenching her fists. "You ruined my life," she screamed. "Because of you, I lost everything. You have no right to treat me like this." Sergei looked at her, his eyes narrowed. "That's your problem, Marina," he said with cold cruelty. "I didn't ask you to ruin your life. You did it yourself. Now deal with it." At that moment, Marina realized that this was not just a man who had betrayed her. Sergei was a real predator who used her weaknesses for his own benefit. He never loved her, never cared about her. Everything he did was aimed at getting money and power over her. For him, she was just a temporary resource that could be used and thrown away when it became unnecessary. Marina couldn't hold back any longer. She stood up from the table, grabbed her bag, and, without saying another word, ran out of the cafe. Her heart was beating so hard it seemed like it would stop. It was a cool evening outside, but she didn't feel the cold, only pain and emptiness. Her life was destroyed, and now she was completely alone. No husband, no family, no one she thought was her love. Sergei was gone from her life, leaving her with nothing, but that didn't mean her suffering was over. She knew she would now have to face even more dire consequences. A broken marriage and debts hanging over her head. After meeting Sergei, Marina felt completely devastated. She returned home late at night feeling that her life had been completely destroyed. Every step she took in the house, which had once been a place of comfort and safety, now seemed like a painful reminder of what she had lost. Alexander no longer spoke to her, and their communication was reduced to the formal remarks necessary for living together. There was an unbearable silence in the air, weighing on her consciousness, and Marina felt that her past life was left far behind. Every morning now began with a heavy heart, and every night was sleepless. Her thoughts constantly returned to what she had done. Mistakes that had seemed insignificant at first were now driving her crazy. She had given all her savings to a man who had no feelings for her. She had destroyed her marriage and betrayed someone who had been faithful to her for many years. All this led to the fact that she no longer saw the meaning in her existence. "Alexander," despite his calm and silent demeanor, continued to seethe with anger and resentment. He knew their marriage was over, and he knew he couldn't forgive Marina for her betrayal. Everything he had ever felt for her, love, trust, care, was gone. Now that the truth had surfaced, he began planning his life without her. Alexander threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself from the thought that his family had been destroyed. But every night when he returned home, a new wave of bitterness filled him. One evening, when the silence in the house became unbearable, Marina decided to have a frank conversation. She had long understood that everything between them was over, but she wanted to at least try to explain her feelings and actions. She hoped that perhaps this would allow her to somehow ease her soul. "Alexander, we need to talk," she said quietly when they sat down at the table. Alexander looked at her with a cold, distant gaze. There was no desire to speak in his eyes, but he nodded, allowing her to begin. Marina lowered her eyes, feeling her whole body tremble. "I know there's no excuse for what I did," she began, struggling to find the words. "I lost myself. I lost control of my actions. I thought I found in him what I needed, but in the end, I lost everything. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I regret every step." Her voice trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. She did not expect an answer from Alexander, realizing that most likely none of her words would be able to bring their relationship back. Alexander was silent for a few seconds before he said, "You're right, Marina. There are no excuses. You destroyed everything we built over the years. I trusted you. We were a family, but now that's gone." His voice was cold and full of disappointment, and Marina felt these words pierce her soul. "I can't live like this anymore," he continued, getting up from the table. "We're done. I'm filing for divorce." These words sounded like a death sentence. Marina knew that this moment would come sooner or later, but hearing it from Alexander was painful. She was left alone at the table, feeling how her life was finally falling apart. The days that followed were an endless cycle of despair and depression for her. Divorce had become an inevitable reality, and with it came even greater financial problems. The loan she had taken out for Sergei loomed over her like a threat she could not ignore. Marina realized that now she would have to pay not only for her mistakes in the relationship, but also for her naivety in financial matters. Every day she woke up with the thought that she no longer had a future. The house that had once been a symbol of stability and love was now a source of pain and a reminder of a life destroyed. Meeting with lawyers, filing divorce papers, and trying to find money to pay off the debt, all this turned her existence into an endless struggle for survival. But the hardest thing was the realization that all of this was her fault. Sergei had left her life, leaving only ruins, and she could no longer hope that someone would come and save her. At that moment, Marina realized that she was completely alone. Her friends had turned their backs on her, and her family had fallen apart. She had lost everything that had once mattered. Marina tried to find a way out, but all she saw in front of her was hopelessness and emptiness. She was left with debts, a broken heart, and a complete loss of the meaning of life. Her despair reached its peak, and she began to think that perhaps there really was no way out. Every step forward seemed impossible, and her future fate remained in question. The days merged into one painful existence, and Marina sank deeper into her despair. The house that had once been her cozy refuge was now a prison. Every room, every object reminded her of her former life, which was no more. Her inner world was destroyed, and only darkness lay ahead. Divorce from Alexander was inevitable, and soon all the legal formalities would be completed. He was not going to give her another chance. Her former life was gone forever. Marina could no longer bear the silence and loneliness that enveloped her every evening. She felt abandoned not only by Alexander, but by the whole world. There was no one left to support her in this difficult moment. Friends and acquaintances stopped showing interest in her life after rumors of her betrayal spread throughout the city. She was left alone with the pain that she herself had created. Financial problems only increased her despair. The loan taken out for Sergei became a heavy burden that she could not bear. Every month, bills arrived that she could no longer pay. Alexander, having learned about the debts, refused to help her. She lost everything: her money, her home, and her family. It seemed that there was no way out. One evening, sitting in the semi-darkness of the living room, Marina realized that she no longer saw the point in continuing to live. Everything she had once valued was destroyed. Her feelings for Sergei were just illusory illusions. Her love for Alexander was betrayed by herself, and the family that was everything to her was destroyed because of her stupidity and naivety. Nothing mattered anymore. She began to think that her presence was only hurting those around her. No one loved her anymore. No one needed her. Marina felt that she had become a burden to everyone, and even life itself no longer brought her comfort. Fear of the future consumed her, and she saw no way out. These thoughts were spinning in her head more and more often. One night, Marina finally decided to take the last step. She made her decision. Gathering all her strength, she wrote a letter to Alexander. In this letter, she laid out her feelings and confessed her guilt. She asked for forgiveness for everything she had done, for those broken hopes and for the pain she had caused him. The letter was short but full of sincere remorse. She left the letter on the kitchen table, where Alexander was supposed to look in the morning. Then Marina, feeling completely empty, made a decision that seemed to her the only way out. She took a sleeping pill and went to the bedroom where she had once been so happy. These walls now held only a shadow of the emotion she had once felt. The medicine began to act quickly, and Marina felt her body sink into silence. She closed her eyes, feeling the pain and suffering gradually recede. Her thoughts flew back to the past, to the times when she was happy, when her life was full of love and meaning. She knew that she was doing something irreparable, but she believed that perhaps this would free her from the pain that had tormented her for the past months. However, her plan did not work as she expected. In the morning, when Alexander returned home, he found her lying unconscious in the bedroom. The letter on the kitchen table was his last warning that something terrible had happened. He immediately called an ambulance, and Marina was taken to the hospital in time. Her life had been saved, but now she faced an even more terrifying reality. She had survived, but she would also have to endure more pain and the realization of her mistakes. Trying to commit suicide had not been a solution, but only aggravated her suffering. Now she had to start all over again, without family, without support, but with a heavy burden of guilt and debt. The fatal outcome of her story was not the end. Now Marina realized that she would have to live with the consequences of her mistakes, and that she had a long road ahead of her to understanding, forgiveness, and perhaps restoration. But this road promised to be incredibly difficult. After her failed suicide attempt, Marina's life took on new, even more difficult colors. Her body was saved, but the mental wound she carried inside her remained open. Now, lying in a hospital ward, she realized the full depth of her mistakes and the consequences they had brought to her life. She had to face the consequences not only of her betrayal, but also of her attempt to escape from these problems. Life went on, but now it was a life filled with pain and loneliness. Alexander visited her only once after he learned of what had happened. He came to the hospital, but not to offer sympathy or consolation. There was no longer anger or resentment in his eyes, only emptiness. Their meeting took place in an atmosphere of tense silence. Marina lay on the bed, realizing that this was the last time she would see her husband. "I don't know what to say," Alexander began, looking down. "I came to tell you that we've completed all the legal procedures. You're free now. The divorce will be finalized in a few days." Marina listened to his words, feeling something inside her finally breaking apart. She understood that this was the end, that nothing could be returned. "I don't hold a grudge against you," Alexander continued. I understand that you yourself are to blame for what happened, but I can't be with you after all this. Goodbye, Marina." He stood up and silently left the room, leaving no hope for forgiveness or a second chance. Marina was left alone. This last conversation became for her the final confirmation that her past remained forever behind a closed door. After being discharged from the hospital, Marina had to face the reality of loneliness and debt that haunted her. She moved into a small apartment that she could afford, but the place felt alien and empty. Life, which was once full of meaning and purpose, turned into an endless struggle for survival. Her existence became isolated and joyless. Sergei disappeared completely, leaving behind only Marina's broken life and the bitterness of deception. He found a new victim, as he predicted, and never again remembered the one who once believed in his false promises. Marina, despite everything that happened, realized that her dependence on this man led to the collapse of her life, and that she herself allowed him to destroy it. Financially, the situation was no less dire. The loan taken out for Sergei remained on her shoulders. The payments were unbearable for her modest income, and she had to sacrifice everything she had to cover the debts. Her life turned into a constant search for money in order to survive, and all her past joys and dreams disappeared behind a dark curtain of debt and shame. But that wasn't the worst thing. Internal suffering, guilt, and loss accompanied her every day. Marina understood that she had caused her own collapse, and this realization was unbearable. She had lost not only money and family, but also herself. Time passed, but the internal wounds did not heal. She suffered from loneliness and isolation, avoiding old friends and acquaintances whom she could not look in the eye. However, through all this suffering, Marina began to understand an important truth. Her life, destroyed by her own decisions, was a reflection of her inner state. She looked for happiness in others instead of understanding herself. Her dependence on other people's love and acceptance led to her giving control of her life to a person who did not deserve it. Now, alone with herself, Marina began to slowly, step by step, look for ways to recover. It was a long and painful process, but it began with the realization that she could no longer afford to live in the past. She understood that she had to find the strength to live on, despite everything that had happened. She sought therapy, hoping to sort through her feelings and understand how her life could have gone down this path. Her sessions with a psychologist became a source of understanding and an opportunity to begin to restore her inner balance. She began to learn to forgive herself, although it was not easy. In the process, she realized that her pain and mistakes did not define her as a person. Yes, she had made terrible mistakes, but that did not mean her life was over. Several years passed, and Marina was still on her way to recovery. Her life was far from ideal, and many wounds had never fully healed, but she had become stronger. She now knew that she could not let others control her destiny, and that her happiness depended only on herself. The fatal outcome of her relationship with Sergei and the breakup of her family left deep scars, but these scars became a lesson for her. She realized that it is important to value yourself, your boundaries, and your life. Several years had passed since Marina had lived through one of the darkest chapters of her life. Time had not healed her completely, but it had helped her see the past from a different perspective. She now understood that it was her decisions and choices that had led to those terrible consequences, but it also gave her hope for the future. She realized that with each passing day, she had a chance to rebuild her life, albeit slowly. After she started therapy, Marina gradually returned to life. Her path was not easy. Every day was filled with internal struggle and constant work on herself. But she did not give up. Each step forward became a symbol of the strength she gradually found within herself. In the early days after leaving the hospital, Marina worked low-paying jobs to help her cope financially. Her debts were still weighing her down, but she began looking for ways to pay them off gradually. She sold everything she could, cut her expenses to a minimum, and even sought financial advice. It was hard, but Marina knew she couldn't afford to be irresponsible any longer. One of the main lessons she learned from her tragedy was the importance of independence. Her entire life up to that point had depended on others, on Alexander, Sergei, her family. But now she understood that she had to build her life on her own efforts and resources. Her relationship with money changed. Marina now understood that financial independence was not only freedom, but also responsibility for her future. Over time, Marina found a new job that not only provided her with income, but also the opportunity to develop. It was a small position at a local publishing house, but it gave her stability and a sense of satisfaction. Her colleagues were friendly and supportive, not knowing the full weight of her past, which was a great relief to her. She found a new environment that did not remind her of her past mistakes. Marina also began actively pursuing self-education. She immersed herself in books on psychology, self-development, and even began learning new skills. This process was a kind of therapy for her. She understood that she could become someone new if she strived for it. A clear goal appeared in her life: to become stronger and more independent than ever. Over time, Marina began to socialize again, slowly rebuilding her social connections. She met a few old acquaintances who had not turned their backs on her after everything that had happened, and she was able to build new friendships. Her new social circle was much smaller than before, but now they were people who supported her without judgment. Marina hadn't forgotten the past. She understood that her mistakes and experiences would always remain a part of her life. However, now she saw them not only as pain, but also as an opportunity for growth. Therapy helped her learn to forgive herself, and this gave her the strength to move on. She stopped making excuses and began to accept the consequences of her actions, but at the same time she realized that she could choose how to build her future. Her relationship with her ex-husband Alexander remained tense, but they learned to talk without accusations. He had built his new life, and although Marina still felt sorry for him, she no longer held a grudge. They occasionally crossed paths over property or mutual acquaintances, and gradually their communication became more neutral. Most importantly, Marina learned to be happy alone. She no longer sought recognition from other people. Now she knew that her own well-being and inner world were more important than any relationship. She learned to take care of herself, spend time alone, and find joy in simple things. Her road to recovery was not yet over, but she was no longer the weak woman who entrusted her life to another person without thinking about the consequences. Marina became wiser, stronger, and more independent. Her mistakes turned into lessons that helped her realize who she really is and what she wants from life. Now, looking ahead, Marina saw new opportunities and challenges that she was ready to face with her head held high. Her life had changed forever, but now she was confident that she could cope with any difficulties that came her way. She realized one important thing: she has a future and it is in her hands.